Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Erin Judge, and I'm the program manager for alumni events at the College of Engineering and Applied Science. I'm excited to be here today with Shilo Brooks. He's the faculty director of our engineering leadership program at the college, and he's joining us for this next webinar in our alumni webinar series. As part of this series, we aim to showcase some of the amazing work and research that's happening at the college, and we bring our faculty directly to you for an exclusive look into their work. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Shilo Brooks. Shilo is the faculty director of CU's Engineering Leadership Program, which puts STEM into conversation with the liberal arts to cultivate engineering and technology leaders of curiosity and character. A political theorist by training, he writes widely on leadership, science, and culture. He holds appointments at the Lockheed Martin Engineering Management Program and the Herbst Program for Engineering, Ethics, and Society, and has been a fellow at Princeton University and the University of Virginia. Shilo, thank you so much for taking the time to share some of your work with our alumni and friends today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm going to try to share my screen, so bear with me. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm going to do something a little different. I hope you can see my screen. What I'm going to do today is talk to you about an undergraduate program. A lot of times folks in these series present their research, which I'm happy to come back and do, but we've got a really special undergraduate program that I think people would want to hear about, and it's been a real success with our undergraduates. And every time I tell alumni about it or tell somebody outside the university about it, they say, "I'd like to hear more about that. That's a great idea." And so my sense is that undergraduates appreciate it a lot, but so do undergraduates at heart. And by that, I mean those of you out there whose driver's licenses may indicate that you're no longer an undergraduate, but in spirit, you are still an undergraduate in some ways because you still love to learn. So let me summarize for a minute what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk you through our engineering leadership program's sort of basic principles, its curriculum, why it exists, how it works. And I'm going to do that by introducing you to some of the books that we read, why we read them, and try to talk to you about what I think is the best way or the ideal way to teach leadership that is bound up fundamentally with fostering intellectual curiosity. And so I'd like to kind of show you how we do that by introducing you to some great human beings who we expose our students to, who we hope that they will take something from and learn something from. So when we first started, thinking about revamping the engineering leadership program in 2018, and I was called on board to do it, as you know from the introduction, I'm not an engineer. The first thing that I did was that I began to look at the headlines and try to think through what is the current state of leadership more broadly. Of course, I had studied political leadership for my whole career, the history and philosophy of leadership in politics. But I began to look at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and every time I saw a headline, I'd cut it out and paste it into a document. And these are some of those headlines. And as you can see, things are not great. You don't see a lot of positive headlines about technology and engineering leadership today. In fact, you can see that some of these headlines are less than a week old or maybe only 2 weeks old. Controversial things, Twitter banning President Trump and CRISPR gene editing, altering human embryos and arguably the human species forevermore. Elon Musk being miserable because he works so much. The New York Times published this. Me Too implicating CEOs and people being ousted from companies. Boeing and its great crises with the MAX, and now today just announcing their earnings are lower than ever before. TikTok and the controversy around that. The story goes on and on and on. And so I thought, well, are the students, that I am teaching, because I had been teaching engineers for some time, are they idolizing these sorts of people? Are they looking at some of these leaders and thinking, that's who I want to be like? Because if so, that's a problem, perhaps. And the story is much more complicated. And this is actually a headline that I cut out of the Wall Street Journal, in which the journal was sort of making the point that in engineering in particular, we tend to deify or make superheroes out of some of the leaders. And that this is dangerous because they fall. A lot of them have fallen. A lot of them have made big mistakes. and that this is not perhaps something that we should do anymore. The idolatry of the tech founder, the idolatry, even if it's not tech, of the CEO, that this is harmful. And so I began to sort of ask myself some questions in cahoots with my colleague, Angela Timandino. And I began to kind of look at the leadership landscape. How are business schools teaching leadership? We have an excellent engineering management program at CU. How are they teaching leadership, right? What's going on in the world of leadership teaching in business, and what's needed, and especially what's needed for undergraduates? Because that's, I'm one of these people who, I love the R1 university and I love being at it, but my belief is still that the university's purpose is fundamentally to educate young people. We're here for them, not for us. And so I wanted to make a program that would enrich their lives. And so I began to think, all right, well, are leadership and management different tasks? In other words, we do a great job of teaching engineering management, and we do a great job in the business school of teaching management. What is the difference between leadership and management? And there's a wonderful article, which I recommend everybody take a look at some point, in the Harvard Business Review, by this gentleman, Abraham Zalzanek. And he talks about the differences between leadership and management. And his claim is that management is fundamentally uncreative insofar as it's conservative. And he doesn't mean politically conservative. He means that managers consult handbooks, policies, tradition at the company to solve problems. And so managerial culture does not cultivate, for instance, a curiosity. It doesn't cultivate a sense for risk-taking. His claim is that in most structures, most of the time, whether it's corporate or political, management is highly bureaucratic. And therefore, if a business or a political enterprise wants to cultivate future leaders, management training arguably does the opposite of that and cultivates a certain kind of bureaucrat. And it's certainly necessary. I'm not trying to be hard on it. I'm simply saying that he identified a very interesting problem in how do you foster a culture which cultivates leaders, because he thinks that leaders and managers are different people. You can see from the italics on the Harvard Business Review, he claims business leaders have more in common with artists than they do with managers. And so I took this as my starting point and thought, what are things that leaders need? What kind of thinking, what kind of education does leadership require? And it seemed to me to require a certain kind of intellectual athleticism, a certain kind of intellectual freedom. And that's what I wanted the program to be about. And so then I sort of asked myself these usual questions: is leadership teachable? Because like all things, I want to play basketball like LeBron James does, but I do not have LeBron James's gifts, right? So in every human endeavor, one begins with a certain set of gifts. Perhaps one can sing. I can't sing like Adele can sing. I just can't do it, no matter how much I train. Is leadership the same? In other words, do you begin with a certain nature for it, and that nature can be brought out through teaching? Or is it entirely teachable? Or is it not teachable at all? And I still don't know the answer to that question, but I've sort of come down at the place where there is a certain disposition, just like there is for any human endeavor. And my goal is to create a curriculum and help students bring out of themselves whatever natural talent they may have. But it's not all talent. There's certainly a big portion of it that's teachable. Then we started to think, well, is engineering leadership different from other kinds of leadership? And I think the answer is in large part no, that leadership transcends disciplinary boundaries, right? That a good leader can lead a number of different kinds of enterprises. And sure, they have their peculiarities and their specific challenges, but a good leader is a good leader simply. That this would be the case whether the person was a CEO or the manager just of a small team at their engineering firm or leading in their community, that there would be commonalities among these. And I can talk more about that later, such that leadership education transcends disciplinary specificity, right? And then going back to some of the thoughts that we had about leadership more broadly in the education, what's the relationship between leadership and curiosity? Leaders, insofar as they will have to confront problems which their education didn't prepare them for. So I'll give you this example. Jack Dorsey just banned the president of the United States from Twitter. An education in computer science does not prepare you to answer the question of whether you should ban the president of the United States from Twitter. That is an extra technical question. It's a question that falls outside of technical education, but engineering and technology are such that they are intersecting with society in a way that technical people are having to solve or at least confront social, political, and moral questions. Does technical education prepare you for that kind of leadership? And it's not just CEOs, it's people on teams. You know, Jack Dorsey's employees, you know, the people who are just on the ground at Twitter are emailing him demanding that he do this or that. They're making their own decisions within their own departments and their own teams and their own two people that they manage. And they're, you know what I mean? And it goes down through the chain, that you're having to think outside of the mere major or the mere job that you occupy. And this is increasingly true, more true with engineering and technology than perhaps any other discipline. It has train wrecked into American democracy, American society. So we need curious people who may not have been trained in what they are having to the problems that they're having to solve, but they'll go read, they'll go learn something about something. They're curious people who are intellectually alive and agile and willing to listen and willing to dive into a new subject, do some research, bring in some experts, weigh it in their hearts. These kinds of people, not people who simply will consult the policy or who simply do whatever they're told, right? And so then finally, we had to ask ourselves, well, can undergraduates even be trained as leaders when they are 18? You know what I mean? They're 19. You know, I see a lot of things at the university, giving young people some hope about the kinds of things that they can do. And I agree, young people are people of tremendous potential. But we do have to remember that, an 18-year-old 4 years ago was 14. And that's not a lot of life in those 4 years. You know what I mean? One has not exactly become a leader. I mean, Abraham Lincoln is a leader. You know, an 18-year-old is still an 18-year-old. So we want to make sure that we're being modest with respect to our expectations, but preparing these young, ambitious people to lead by the right way, by introducing them to the right people while understanding that they're still young and not overselling to them what we can do for them and not falsely inflating their hopes. So what I began to do is think through whether there were examples of people, great people, who I might introduce our students to, who could teach them something that I can't teach them because these people were extraordinary in a way that I simply am not, but that we might sit down together, me and these students, and investigate the lives of extraordinarily curious people by way of books and learn something about our own hopes and ambitions through them. Because I always tell the students this, and I tell all of you attending this, you are one person, you are one human being, and you can live one life from the age of 0 to say 95. You will live the one life. But there's a cheat, there's a hack, right? You could live 1,000 lives if you want to. And the way to do that is to read the lives of others, to read biography and autobiography, to live those lives. We hear a lot today that we don't have access to one another's experiences. Maybe somebody is a different gender or different race than me. And so the claim is I don't have access to their experiences. But the fact of the matter is that when you read a book written by someone who's not you, the power of imagination is strong. Now, you don't live their life the way they lived it. I would not claim that. But what I would claim is that we're not so walled off from one another as we sometimes like to think that we are. You can, for a short period of time, if you read a biography of a great human being, say the Wright Brothers or Abraham Lincoln, you can live that life a bit. You can put yourself in their shoes. You can be 1,000 people in one. And instead of having your 2 eyes, you can have 2,000 eyes. And instead of having your one soul, you can bring to bear the souls of the most extraordinary people in the world on your own. Take them into you. Use them as nutrition. Ingest them and become like them. Shed what you don't like, keep what you do. And so that's what the curriculum is organized around. And so I began to think, who are people whose lives are exemplary? And what do these people have in common? And how can looking at these people teach our young engineers and aspiring leaders to be better than some of the Silicon Valley leaders who are making headlines, right? And so the first people that I thought about immediately was the Wright brothers. And so what I'm going to do now in this part of the presentation is walk you through some of, say, our introductory curriculum. What is it that we're doing in class? Why is it that reading books can foster leadership and intellectual curiosity and intellectual agility and athleticism? And who are some people who prove that that's true, right? And so the Wright brothers were the first example that came to mind. David McCullough, who is, as many of you probably know, is a great biographer, has written a biography of the Wright brothers, which I recommend to everybody. I got sort of obsessed with them when I was looking into this. In fact, I was on a fellowship sabbatical leave last year, and I just read for a long period of time in the evenings, the Wright brothers' letters to one another and their technical writings. What's so extraordinary about them is this. They were two ordinary people from Dayton, Ohio, who solved arguably the most difficult engineering problem in human history for the cost of $1,000 when no one said it could be done, and when everyone else who was trying to do it was a university professor with funding from the government for millions of dollars. These two guys ran a bicycle shop in Dayton, didn't go to college, and are flying airplanes around the United States. It's just astonishing, this story. And so I got so into it that I wrote an article for Scientific American on the Wright brothers to try to make people aware of the fact that there are some extraordinary people out there that we can introduce young people to, and that they can emulate these people. So I refer you to this. But one of the things that's so extraordinary about the Wrights, and why the students and I get so excited about them, is here are some of the attempts at flight prior to what the Wrights did, right? Samuel Langley's aerodrome. I don't know about you, but that doesn't look to me like it's going to fly. I mean, it looks like a problem. And in fact, that's what happened. That aerodrome launched off of that houseboat and plunged directly into the Potomac, right? And then you can see some other examples on the right side of typical engineering solutions to these sorts of problems. We want to fly? Let's build a bird and get inside of it. That's sort of how an engineer thinks, you know. These, unfortunately, were also equally tragic. You can see Lilienthal on the bottom. Doesn't look like it's going to go well. And in fact, eventually he did die from jumping off of these plateaus with bird's wings on. But let me show you the Wright Flyer. This, if you were a person who had never been in civilization, you had no idea what was going on, and you walked up to this sitting in an open field, you wouldn't know what it was. But I bet if you looked at it long enough, you might think to yourself, you know what? I think that thing might fly. It just looks like it's going to fly. So the question is, how did these two guys from Dayton, Ohio, nobodies really, solve a problem that, you know, cavemen would look up at birds and say, if only I could fly? Archimedes, you know, Leonardo da Vinci, all kinds of engineers all over the world. These two guys in Dayton who run a bike shop? So that's the question, right? Well, one of the things that permitted them to solve the problem of flight is their great curiosity. They would read widely. So, for example, the great difficulty in solving the problem of flight was not gliding. Almost anyone could glide. The hard thing to do was to steer the craft, to make it take off and land from the same point and steer it in the air. So they studied birds. They were always very interested in biology. They studied birds' wings and looked at the way birds torsionally rotate their wings, incorporated some of those principles into their patented wing twisting system. And lo and behold, they figured out a way to control the craft by way of twisting their wings, similar to the way you see flaps on airplanes today. So pretty extraordinary. And they didn't get it by, you know, by being specialists. They got it because they just happened to be interested in biology. And they would stand in the sands of Kitty Hawk and they would look up into the air in their ties and their derby hats. And the locals would be like, who are these idiots standing out in the middle of the dunes, looking up in the air at birds? You can imagine these guys wearing ties, just looking up in the air. And so, but they were just that curious, you know what I mean? And the same as they were interested in bridge building, and they were curious, how do we get the structures of this light craft to be solid such that it won't break apart in the air? So they studied things like the Brooklyn Bridge, and you can see the cables running from the bridge, similar in character to the cables that are part of the twisting system of the wings of the plane. When they were interviewed after they had become world famous for making flying machines, a reporter and friend told Orville Wright that he and his brother would always stand as examples of how far Americans could come with no special advantages. You know, you guys had no advantages. You guys were just two boys from Dayton, and lo and behold, look at you now. And he said, it's not true that we didn't have special advantages. We did. To say we had no special advantages is false. The greatest thing in our favor was growing up in a family where there was always much encouragement to intellectual curiosity. And if you look at McCullough's biography, one of the things you find is that in their home, they would read Dickens, Washington Irving, Hawthorne, Twain, Walter Scott, Plutarch, Milton, Gibbon, Thucydides, great Greek historians. They would read travel volumes, Darwin's Origin of Species, encyclopedias. They were just constantly reading, and they grew up in a home where curiosity was the name of the game. Their parents instilled this in them, gave them a love for books and a love for looking at the world in its natural, mechanical, literary, artistic beauty. and understanding it and appreciating it, right? And so you can see this always stuns me. After Orville and Wilbur got the Wright Flyer working, they went to France to demo it. And here's a beautiful quotation from McCullough's Wright Brothers biography. He says, of all that Paris offered, it was the Louvre that Wilbur kept going back to on his visit again and again. He would spend hours there walking in the galleries. Such a keen interest as he had in art was not only remarkable in someone so committed to technical innovation, but a measure of a truly exceptional capacity of mind. As weeks and then months passed, Wilbur of his own choice visited the Louvre 15 times. And then when he was relaxing, he would always talk when the reporters came and whatnot of literature, art, history, music, science, architecture, and painting. He had a deep appreciation for this. And this comes out, he talks sometimes in some of his writings about it, they had to understand that flying wasn't merely technical, it was artistic. That the pilot's art, just as to sing or to play the cello well, you have to train for thousands and thousands of hours. The same is true, as those of you who are alumni know who have gone to flight school. To fly is an art. You have to train for thousands of hours and be able to read wind conditions and dance with the craft and dance in the air. And he says that was as much a breakthrough for us, which is an artistic consideration, an artistic cast of mind, as the technical details that we worked out. So these are the kinds of people that we read about, that we introduce students to, that we want them to emulate. Now I'll introduce you to another cast of characters who have little to do with engineering. But as I said, I think that great leadership, and especially the kind of curiosity required to foster great leadership, is transdisciplinary. It doesn't matter who you're reading about. You can take something from him. And of course, this is Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, a man who, like the Wright brothers, did not even go to college, was self-educated entirely in rural Illinois. And I was at Princeton this past year, and there's a great historian there, Alan Gelzo, who wrote a book called Abraham Lincoln, Man of Ideas. And I read that book, and that's what put me onto this about Lincoln. And then I read some of Doris Kearns Goodwin's work, and now we read some of these things in class. But Lincoln was an extraordinarily curious, well-read man. So he grew up, again, in rural Ohio. Rural Illinois. You couldn't get access to reading material, right? And so he was desperate to do that. And his relatives and neighbors would remember him, and they would say, Lincoln would scour the countryside to borrow books, and he'd read every volume he could get his hands on. And every time you saw him as a young man, he had a book with him that he had gotten from somewhere. And when he had to return it, he basically memorized it. And he explored literature, the history of the country. He already had conscious of his own powers, and he began to imagine ways of living beyond those of his family and neighbors. And that's what I mean when I say you can be 1,000 people in one. You may grow up in a place where you don't have access to a lot of great people that you admire. Maybe you feel lonely, or whatever the case may be. Go and find company in the great human beings before you. Learn history, read literature, do like Lincoln did. Imagine ways of living beyond your mere 95 years. Put all of the years, all of the millennia of mankind into your soul. Fill out your human capacities, right? And so you can see here again with Lincoln, he studied philosophy, astronomy, science, political economy, history, literature, poetry, drama. He would work out math, theorems, and proofs in his spare time. Lincoln loved Euclid. And so he would study the Greek geometer Euclid, work through his propositions, and this gave Lincoln much of his, when you read the Lincoln Douglas debates and you see him methodically taking apart Douglas, it's almost like he's doing a geometric proposition. It disciplined his mind. And from his earliest years, when he couldn't understand something, he would turn the phrases over in his mind until he could understand them. And his friend recalled that he would read and study for hours. After everyone else had gone to sleep, he'd put a candle on his chair at the head of his bed, and he would lay there till 2 a.m. Reading books. And when he went to law school, because he didn't go to law school, when he decided he wanted to be a lawyer, he couldn't go to law school, so he had to pass the exam by just reading the books. He would borrow them. But the difficulty was that the closest friend who had a set of law books was in Springfield. So he would go 20 miles from New Salem to Springfield to get a book. He'd read it, then he'd walk the 20 miles to exchange it for another one. And then when a young person asked him about this, he said, look, the way to do this is to get the books and read and study them, right? That's what he told a law student. That's what he did. He loved filling himself with this kind of knowledge. And much like I said to you that the engineering leaders of today are confronting crises that their education didn't prepare them for. Lincoln had the same situation. No one is ready for a civil war. No leader could be ready for the kind of challenge Lincoln faced. But he was a man who was up to the challenge. He was a man who had the cast of mind, the curiosity, the character, because he had made himself whole and full to meet that challenge. And he was a great leader for it. There are people in the same era Frederick Douglass, who Lincoln was in communication with. Frederick Douglass was a close observer of Lincoln. They met at one point. Frederick Douglass, for those of you who don't know, is one of the first great, if not the first great civil rights leader in America. He escaped from slavery. We did a reading group on him in the engineering leadership program. He wrote 3 autobiographies. Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass is the first one. I highly recommend it. The second one, which I just read with students, is called My Bondage, My Freedom. But Douglass tells a similar story as the one Lincoln tells about his life. And so you'll see, for example, in Douglass, one of the things that he credits from having liberated him from slavery, he escaped, his body escaped. But he said, it was my mind that required liberation first. And I was free when I learned to read. Even though I wasn't technically free until I escaped, I learned to read in slavery, and I was free at that point. And so he says, once I learned to read, I understood what had been a most perplexing difficulty, namely the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement. I prized it highly. From the moment that I learned to read, and it's an extraordinary story of how a slave could learn to read. I mean, you should really check this out. I'm not going to go over it right now, but can you imagine a person in the dregs of slavery learning to read, teaching himself? But he said, when I saw what reading did for me, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. It was what I needed. Though conscious of the difficulty of learning without a teacher, I set out with high hope and fixed purpose at whatever cost and whatever trouble to learn to read. And he says similar things. He says he got a hold of certain books, that he read them, certain newspapers that were critical of slavery. He was able to articulate his thoughts, to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain it. The more I read, the more I was able to abhor and detest my enslavers. So a similar story, Douglass claims that he was liberated when his mind was liberated, even though his body was still in chains. And that the thing that made him a great orator, the thing that made him go on to be Frederick Douglass and have statues, made and write these extraordinary books about himself, was learning to read. That this filled him and allowed him to become a person he wasn't. He was in a narrow lane as a slave. He had been told that slavery was right and good and just, and it wasn't until he began to consider other opinions, alternative views, that he became compelled and able to articulate challenges to these horrible sophistries. The last person that I want to introduce you to is Sandra Day O'Connor. She was the first female Supreme Court justice. A beautiful biography of hers was published just last year by an author named Evan Thomas called First. And when you listen to interviews with Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, Amy Coney Barrett, you will hear Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who joined the court, in fact, when O'Connor was still on the court. They all cite O'Connor as an inspiration to them. And they all cite the conviviality of this woman, the tremendous humanity of this woman, the fullness of spirit of this woman. And you begin to think, well, how did she get that? Because like Lincoln, like the Wright brothers, like Frederick Douglass, she had modest origins. She was not, blue blood. She grew up on a ranch called the Lazy Bee in Arizona. And you can imagine rural Arizona, a ranch, is not exactly, what you think of when you think the next Supreme Court justice. You think Harvard, or these sorts of things. O'Connor worked her way up to be one of the first young female undergraduates at Stanford. So, and this was back when Stanford was not Stanford as we know it. It was back when Stanford was podunk, Western University. It was not Stanford of today. And she was one of the first undergraduates there. And in fact, once she graduated, she became one of the first female law students at Stanford. And when you read her biography, the things that stand out is from the time she was a young girl, this is a quotation from Thomas, during the heat of the day on the Lazy Bee Ranch, she'd lie on the sofa in her parents' bedroom, a book in her hands. And this was her family's pastime, just like the Wrights. Similar, she was asked to look back after her time on the court at what it was that made her who she was. And one of the things that she cited was the history of Western civilization courses, which are sort of begin at Plato and go all the way up to authors in the 1970s or 80s, Martin Heidegger and such, those big Western civilization survey courses that were required of all freshmen at the time. She said, I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. Something registered with me. And she said, you know, I would devote hours to reading these books in the Western Civ reading room and studying the great books in particular. She loved to read the classics. You know, and of course, for a judge, what better preparation than to read, you know, these Roman, Greek books along with Locke, the American founding, these kinds of books, you know, prepared her for a life of jurisprudence. And she had no idea she wanted to be a lawyer at the time. She wrote home, and I always love this quotation because she wrote home as a young girl in a letter, and the letter's published in the book. And they, you know, the biographer says she was no longer just a high school girl hiding her good grades, but she would gush about her time at Stanford. And she said, college just gets better and better. It's the utopia that the philosophers we studied about in history dreamed of. It could not be better. And so she said, this was when she was a freshman, people are different here than they were in high school. They like to talk about things like politics and religion. And this is what I have in mind. That college can still be this. We focus so much on job preparation. We focus so much on what are you going to do when you leave? But these people have this view of the intellectual life, which permits them to go on to be great because they embrace their curiosity in all of its manifold facets. And Sandra Day O'Connor is precisely such a woman. And so she's to be admired, and she's in the same pile as many of these other great people. And I could mention more and more and more. I'll just mention two more things and then I'll take questions. One of the things that we do in the program as well is we'll read ancient Greek philosopher Xenophon. He wrote this extraordinary book called The Education of Cyrus, which is the story of a great leader, an extraordinary political nature. And we'll learn about Cyrus over the course of several weeks, and we'll try to understand what Xenophon's trying to teach us about justice, about morality, about politics, about leadership. And then we will compare ancient leaders, and the students really enjoy this, to modern people. So Cyrus creates an empire. It spans the world, right? He wants to make the world more open in a way, just a giant mass that belongs to him. Well, I point out to the students, Mark Zuckerberg has an empire, and they see it immediately. 2.7 billion people log into Facebook every day. That's a giant empire over which he rules, who makes the decisions. And to give you some perspective, there are 2.5 billion Christians in the world, 1.9 billion Muslims. There are more people on Facebook than in either of the world's two largest religions. And so we will look at Mr. Zuckerberg's ambitions, his leadership decisions, his errors, his successes in light of Xenophon's teaching about leadership. And the students love it. We do the same thing with Niccolò Machiavelli, who wrote a book called The Prince, one of the greatest books on leadership and politics ever written. We'll read The Prince. And of course, anyone who has ever heard the word Machiavellian knows that Machiavelli recommends that one lie, cheat, steal, deceive, and whatever else one has to do to get ahead. Although one should appear at all times to be very moral, one can actually be very immoral and use that to meet necessity. In a sense, one could be a fraud. And so we will read The Prince and try to understand Machiavelli's teaching, and then we will look at fraudulent leaders and try to see whether they adequately understand Machiavelli's teaching. Maybe they don't understand it at all, and they should have read them if they wanted to be good frauds. Maybe it's wrong to be a fraud, and you can't be a good fraud. That's a contradiction in terms. And so one of the people that we look at is Elizabeth Holmes, who is currently this year going to go on trial for the Securities and Exchange Commission for having deceived the public, the media, her board, her investors. Read about her. She's the greatest fraud, arguably, in Silicon Valley history so far. She had this company Theranos, which she claimed could do things with medical technology. You know, you could take a drop of your blood and you could put it in this machine, and it would give you all these. It would run all these tests, and it would revolutionize the healthcare industry. And you could send the results to your doctor, and they could adjust your prescriptions in real time and look at your preconceived the conditions to which you were predisposed and these kinds of things. And she was a fraud. And so we'll read Machiavelli in the context of this and try to learn something about fraudulent leadership by way of comparison. So I'm going to stop there. A lot of times I'm asked, well, what books do you read? What kinds of things do you recommend? And I'm happy to talk about that in the 22 or 20 so minutes that remain for Q&A. But here are some of the great figures. There's some of the teachers that would return to the engineering leadership program. I'm not the teacher in a way these people are. And so that's what we do. We try to get students to learn lessons from great minds who came before them and bring to bear the leadership wisdom of the past on contemporary problems. Because my view, and I think I can convince the students of this, although they're skeptical of it at first, is that these lessons are timeless, that the challenge of leadership doesn't really change. It comes at us in different clothing. Of course, Aristotle or Xenophon or Machiavelli or Abraham Lincoln could not have thought of Twitter. But the way that one conducts oneself, the way that one thinks through a problem in crisis, the kind of prudence required, above all, to foster prudence in a leader, that doesn't change, and the way of getting there doesn't change. So that's what the Engineering Leadership Program is about. And I'm now going to see if I can stop sharing my screen and take some of your questions. So thank you guys so much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shilo. That was a lot of great information and some really good takeaways there. I apologize, my camera decided not to work at this time, but we did get a ton of great questions in from the audience. So I will start with those, and please feel free, everyone, we have that Q&A button down at the bottom. So please feel free to enter in your questions as we're going here. So Shilo, you just mentioned at the very end there, I know you threw up a screen with some great books, and we did receive a lot of questions about types of books. So this one from Daniel we'll start with. What are your top 5 book recommendations for leaders?
Yeah, I mean, that's a one that I get asked a lot, and I think is hard. I mean, I have 2 answers to it. One answer is, and I'll answer the question, don't worry, but I would say in the beginning, it's not a valid question. In a certain sense, what I've just said is go and seek your nourishment. Find people who inspire you. Don't let someone tell you what to do. A curious person like Lincoln, like the Wright brothers, doesn't follow the prescription of someone else. They look inside their heart and they say, what do I need? What do I need? And then they go and they find. And so that's what I would suggest to you when looking for a book is there a person out there? Is there a topic out there? Is there something out there who you're inspired by, who you think, I've always, whatever it is in me, maybe your husband or your wife or your friends think that person's not interesting, but you do. Go and learn from that person. But I think more deeply than that, I do think that there are people from whom one can learn. This program is predicated on the notion that one would want to avoid what I would call snake oil salesmen. You'll find in leadership all the time, someone asking you to pay $14.99. They will then provide you with a book, and it will have 10 principles, and you will read those, and it will transform your career, and it will transform your whole company. And then you can subscribe to their monthly newsletter for, a fee. That's what you want to avoid. Go and read Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals, right? Go and see how Lincoln assembled a cabinet of people who disagree and why that was a good thing and why that's so rare today, right? Go and read an ancient history and learn about the way ancient statesmen, worked. Go and read a book about somebody who's broken down a barrier, somebody who said something can't be done. Go and read about Alan Turing. Go and read about Michael Jordan. But I think the best thing that you can do, I suspect that there is an order of rank of books. In other words, there are some books that have stood the test of time for a reason. And so I think seek out those books first, seek out those people first, men, women, events that you think are inspiring. But my focus is typically for this purpose on biography and autobiography. So that would be my answer to the question. I don't want to give you any specifics, although I did kind of give you some.
That's great. And that covers, we had a lot of questions too about types of genres to look into. So I think that kind of covers everything there. We had a question coming from Keith. How did these historic leaders create the time to do broad reading and learning? And I would add to that, what are some of your suggestions for people to, prioritize this in their day-to-day?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in my own life, and as I read about these people and every year I try to add a couple books in that I've never read and people who I don't know anything about to try to see, to keep it fresh for me and these kinds of things. What always ends up being the case is that, people who, and this is going to sound really irritating perhaps to some folks, but it's like going to the gym. You don't want to do it. Some days you don't want to do it. It's same as brushing your teeth. Sometimes I'm like, God, I got to brush my teeth again. And then I've got 90 more years, 80, 50 more years of brushing my teeth. You got to make yourself do it. You know what I mean? And that's not easy, but that's the way it works. Lincoln, you just saw, would read until 2 in the morning. He was trying to be a lawyer at the same time, right? That's hard work. You know, Sandra Day O'Connor growing up on a ranch, having to help with the ranch, but she'd make time for it. And so what I can say to you is, the same way you got to make it part of your routine, the same way you make brushing your teeth or exercising or taking your kids to school. And there are days that you don't want to do it, and there are days that you want to tap out, but you cannot tap out because these things have to be done. Elevate this priority to that. And it's not going to be fun. It's not going to be pleasant, but you will find that 9 times out of 10, it is rewarding, because you can sit, and there are days when you won't want to do it, but most of the days you will, because you can sit down and let your heart and your mind be filled with the wisdom of someone else. And we don't make enough time for that. And so what I'm saying is there's no secret other than devoting yourself to it. I mean, I'll give you this example. Winston Churchill, who I didn't mention, but who's an extraordinary leader, certainly has his flaws like anybody else, made some bad decisions, just like many other leaders. Lincoln made some bad decisions. But in his lifetime, Churchill was a great reader and an extraordinary writer. So he not only was involved in politics his whole life, he not only saved, you know, the West from the specter of Hitler and Nazism, but his collected writings, he wrote history and these kinds of things, are bigger than Shakespeare and Dickens combined. That's how big Churchill's histories, you know, when you take them page for page, he wrote more than those guys. And he loved painting. He painted 500 canvases, over 500 canvases in his lifetime. Meanwhile, he managed to be Winston Churchill. And so I'm saying he found something he loved and he did it because that's what he wanted to do. He devoted himself to it. And so that's really the secret. And it's not much of a secret. It just requires some self-discipline and finding something you love such that it doesn't feel like work all the time. Sometimes it will.
Great. And sort of on a related note, so we have a question from Lauren. She's asking, in this fast-paced bottom line world, what advice do you have for techniques to increase curiosity within our employees?
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one. And you know, that's why I talked about, is this disposition or can it be taught? And you, the person who's asking this question, have hired a lot more people than I have. And so I suspect you know what you're getting, you know, more than I do when you see somebody or when you interview somebody. But I would say look for a spark. You know, I always tell the students this: you're going to get great internships and you're going to make great grades and you're going to sit in a pile of resumes and you're all going to look like each other. And the question you have to ask yourself is not how do I meet that bar? It's how do I exceed that bar? And so what the secret is going to be is that when you go in for an interview, there's going to be some spark that sets you apart from the 10 other people with the exact same resume that you have who are trying to get this entry-level job. And that spark is what this program is about. If you are inspired by, curious about these people in the world, that will become evident. And so I say to you, look for that spark in people. And then if you've already got a corporation or an enterprise, you know, this is going to sound cheesy and I don't know how well it would work, and maybe it wouldn't work, although maybe in our times of Zoom it would work well. Host reading groups. You know, I do this for my students when they leave the class, you know, they move on and take other classes. They always say, Professor Brooks, I wish I was still in your classes. And so I say to them, well, look, on Fridays from 3 to 4, I'm going to pick a book. I get to pick it, but you guys get to show up and we're going to read it together. And so I start these little pockets of community where people are excited to get together once or twice a month and read a book together and talk about it together. We get to know each other. We get to know the book better. These kinds of things can be implemented into a business. And it might be weird at first, but my suspicion is that people over the long term would deeply appreciate it. So these are some ideas, although it's very hard.
Great. And I think you've touched on this a little bit, but I have a question here from Herbert. Can you speak to the importance of a general liberal arts curriculum in training from critical thinking and values formation?
Yeah, I think it's of the utmost importance. And I think, I mean, in a way, that's the unarticulated take-home message of the presentation that I've just given you, is that if we lose liberal education, if we lose sight of it in the academy, even in engineering, you know, when the College of Engineering at CU, your alma mater, is growing fast, and, you know, the technical requirements are high, you know, to graduate. But if we lose sight of liberal education, and for people who don't know, when I say liberal education, I mean liberty, an education in liberty. And when I say an education in liberty, I mean freeing your mind. That is to say, calling your convictions, your prejudices, your hopes into question, and seeing whether they can withstand the assault of alternative points of view, showing yourself new things, new intellectual adventures that you might never have gone on had you not been required by your university to do that, had they just said, you can stay in your lane and major in computer science. If we lose that, we will, it will be a civic crisis. And maybe we're already seeing some of that now, but it will be an utter civic crisis, not to say perhaps even an economic one. So my response to you is it's utterly important. It is the shaping agent, and it's not just for liberal arts colleges. You don't just have to go to some expensive college on the East Coast. You can, state universities should have a place for it. And I would say this, which will be controversial, perhaps to some who may be humanists like me. Liberal education doesn't mean reading the scholarship on Shakespeare. It doesn't mean reading what the scholars say about Lincoln. It means reading the man's words. It means reading the woman's words. It means sitting down with the actual source. You're not here to train scholars. I'm not here to train scholars. I'm here to train people. And so I want them to meet the great mind and not have many intermediaries in between. And so I think that if these things can persist in the university in small pockets, it'll be really great. That's my hope. That's my goal.
Absolutely. Let's see here. So we have a question here from Aaron. What's the last important thing that you have been wrong about or changed your mind about, maybe in regards to this leadership and a teachable art?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I can say this broadly. There are authors and people who I've read about or who I've, studied, and who, when I was younger, I thought that's a waste of time. And so there are intellectual adventures that I've gone on before, and I thought, well, this person is not worthy of my time. It's a waste of my time. And I will say that as I've gotten older, my mind has changed about any number of historical figures, about any number of people who have taken positions, leaders in particular in hard times, who when I was younger, I might have blamed and said, well, if I'm reading FDR or something and he makes some, some kind, and I think, well, that's just wrong from top to bottom, just totally unprincipled, or, these sorts of things. I would read Jefferson as a young man and I was sort of be appalled by him. And then I got to the University of Virginia and realized what a genius he was. But I always tell the students that the great thing about reading books is that they will appear to you one way when you're 18. Reread them when you're 25, 35, 45, 55. That book will stay the same. But what will happen is that you will grow and you will get older. And so it's like reading a new book, and you can come back and get new nourishment from an old thing. And so I would say that I am having to learn for myself that I am a person who formerly would just sort of cast out things, ideas. I was kind of set in my ways. And now as I come back to things as I get older, I realize that, first of all, I was wrong. And second of all, it's okay to be wrong. It's okay to change your mind. It's okay to say you were wrong. It's okay to say, I used to think this thing and now I think a different thing. And today in our society, we often say to people who don't have what we think is the right opinion the first time, you're out of here, you're canceled, you're fired, right? It's okay to be wrong. We're all fallible people. It's actually great to be wrong, because when someone shows you that you're wrong, you can learn something new, right? Because the old opinion has to be discarded. And this has happened to me all the time in all sorts of intellectual, moral, and political matters. And I think it's the disposition that one would want to cultivate in one's students.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Ralph. Does the CU Engineering Management Program have connections to the CU PLC? And that stands for the President's Leadership Class.
Yeah, you mean the Engineering Leadership Program have connections to PLC? Yes, the answer is yes. So the President's Leadership Class, for people who don't know, CU is a very leadership focused university, and that takes different forms. My program is very different from other programs. We're just one of many in the flora and fauna. But the President's Leadership Class is a great leadership preparation program at CU. My colleague, Angela, teaches for them a lot of times, and some of their students, in fact, come to us and can get credit for some of their courses through our courses. And so we love interacting with them, and we just created on campus a Center for Leadership so that those of us who are doing this kind of work can finally get together, once or twice a year and talk to one another, because before we were sort of siloed and there wasn't a kind of central body. So the Center for Leadership is new. guided by the director of PLC, Aaron Roof, and he's a great friend. And so we definitely try to work with him as much as we can.
Great. Question here from Andrew. In your opinion, is the development of future engineering and scientific leadership being stifled by the pressures to develop specific expertise? In other words, have we begun to overvalue deep and narrow knowledge over the wide-ranging polymath?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say yes or no, but I'm going to say yes because I mean, my presentation puts my hand on the table. You know, my cards are obvious to everyone. I do think that that's a danger, whether it's happened or not. I can't say, but I do worry, and I don't worry. I'm not worried because I'm looking at the curriculum in engineering and I know a whole lot about what engineers study. That's not that because I'm not an expert in that. But what I do have is the students walk through my door who are in that curriculum after 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, and 4 years. And they tell me that's how they feel. And so I take them at their word. There's some food that they're seeking that they're not being fed. And I think that's a real problem. And they tell me in a certain way, you know, because you guys are all engineers, or most of you on this call, you know, they do these problem sets every night, and you remember this and the grind of the engineering major, and it's notoriously grindy in this way. And they'll tell me when I get to the homework for your class, it's like respite. It's like a thirsty person finding a river, that they just love to sit down and just turn it off and just engage with another human being, learn from another human being. And that tells me that there's something that they're being driven to do a little bit too hard. And that if we continue that in that way, we are going to have people who, and we already do have people who are narrow specialists without soul. And that's going to be a real problem. And I think the students can kind of feel themselves becoming that. They'll often tell me, you know, I used to play cello in high school, or I used to have these hobbies, and I don't have those hobbies anymore. And I used to be interested in books and, you know, these kinds of things. And so I do think it's a real danger. And so my hope is that we can correct that. And a case has to be made. You know, one has to make the case for this. It's not just going to correct itself. And so that's what the program is for.
Perfect. We've gotten a couple questions here that focus around how leadership has changed and evolved over the years. So I'll read this one from Betty. She says, as we all know, what is considered a great book and who is considered a leader has evolved so much over the decades to include women, people of color, those who are not presidents, and monarchs. I'm curious about whether and how you address this with your students.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you saw the leaders that I introduced you today were people who were ordinary people, ordinary men and women who were not, you know, Abraham Lincoln was not a monarch. He grew up in rural Illinois. The Wright Brothers, you know, were in a bicycle shop. Sandra Day O'Connor grew up on a farm. I mean, absolutely, I address that because I want to introduce these students to people who are like them. You know, they're always stunned when I tell them that these people were not, you know, and we'll read people who were, you know, we'll read a biography of Catherine the Great. She was the extraordinary, you know, Russian queen who everybody should read the newest biography on Catherine the Great. She's really an extraordinary woman. But I want to put the students in touch with people who are like them. You know, there's a great book that we've read in the past by Condoleezza Rice called Extraordinary Ordinary People, a memoir of family. And the students are stunned to hear that Condoleezza Rice, you know, first Black female Secretary of State, she went to the University of Denver. She's just like you. You know, she was a Black woman in the South, you know, grew up in Birmingham, faced a lot of challenges. Her dad got a job out in Colorado. She came out, went to the University of Denver, made it all the way to be a professor at Stanford, Secretary of State of the United States. She's just like, why can't you do that? So absolutely, we want to bring students into conversation with people like them. For me, that's the most valuable thing, is to present them with people who they look at them and they say, look, maybe I can do that. I don't have to be Elon Musk, you know, maybe I can be somebody like this. So absolutely, Betty, thank you.
Great, we have time for just a couple more questions here. So question came in from Chris. He's saying this program wasn't around when he was an undergrad. And is there a way for alumni to take part in this program or contribute in any way? What suggestions would you have?
Well, look, you know, you're right. I mean, the engineering leadership program was originally built in 2011, but you know, it didn't really. In 2018, when I was brought on board, I sort of completely changed it, and you know, changed the mission, incorporated this sort of, you know, this way of teaching leadership that I described for you today. So unless you graduated in 2018 to now, you wouldn't have any idea this existed. And of course, if you're a member of the old leadership program, which was really good, You probably have seen from my presentation that, it's taken on a different spirit. But with respect to interacting with the alumni, I say to you, Aaron, I would love to do more, and I welcome you, and I can envision scenarios in which, we get together and read things with the alumni, in which, we like to invite alumni to campus who have gone on to be leaders, who've gone on to do things, and have them talk to our students. That's the other part of the program, is we don't just want to be about history. We want to take people from CU who have done great things, and I'll bring them into my classroom with Aaron's office, with their help, and I'll put them in front of students and host a lunch for them and let them share some of their wisdom with our students from the real world, boots on the ground, in an engineering position of leadership. So I can envision you helping me, and then I can envision me saying, well, hey, alumni, let's get together and let's talk about this reading on Zoom or something like that. I think it'd be a great idea. Or when you come back to CU, let's host a night where we all get together and have a nice meal and read through something and get to know each other. So we love to have your participation.
That's great, Shilo. And we love to too. So to that point, please reach out. We'll send follow-up messages after this webinar today. If you are interested in being involved and connecting with us and with Shilo, we're happy to facilitate that. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And Shilo, we have time for one more question here, and I missed it in the queue, but I thought it was an interesting one. So I apologize, I don't have who said it, but someone is curious to know, it looks like there is a quote on your bookcase behind you on the top there, and we are curious to know what it is.
Oh, well, it's very fitting. This is actually the best last question that you possibly could have asked, so good on you. That is a big wooden, carving, and I got it at Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and I love Jefferson, the most curious American, arguably, and go to his house. He's got waiters and he's doing science, and there's pictures of Francis Bacon on the wall, and he's, it's crazy. He's got winery. I mean, it's crazy. But the quotation is taken from one of his letters, and it says this: "I cannot live without books." That's what it says. So thank you. I leave you with the wise words of Thomas Jefferson.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Shilo. And thank you for this presentation. This was wonderful. Everyone, we had so many amazing questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to all of them today, but I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. I will send out a link tomorrow that will have a link where you can go to see where we keep all of the past recordings of our webinars. This one will be posted there in about 1 week. So before we go, though, I'm just going to throw up a quick poll here. We really appreciate your feedback, and we would love to hear how you felt about this webinar today. So if you could just let us know on a scale of 1 to 10, if you would recommend our alumni webinars to a friend, we would appreciate it. Additionally, just again, please be on the lookout for that email from me tomorrow. We'll include some additional information on the Engineering Leadership Program, how you can stay connected to us. We'll also show you some of the upcoming events and webinars that we still have. So thank you again, everyone, for joining, and special thank you, Shilo, to you for this amazing presentation. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all.